Hello, everyone. We are excited that you have chosen to join us today with the Family and Youth Services Bureau Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Programs webinar in observance of May as National Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month. I especially want to thank our Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Program SRAE and PrEP grantees, our federal partner grantees, and federal staff for joining us today. We are seeing the numbers climb and expect to have over 600 webinar participants. I know that you join me in recognizing that your efforts to contribute to the resiliency of youth across the nation has never been more important than during this time. Today's public health emergency, as perhaps like none other in our history, is putting our resiliency to the test, not just for our young people, but for all of us. I must say that you've demonstrated tremendous ability to overcome, to be flexible, and to be very innovative and creative, and that makes us all wiser and stronger. Our theme for this year's celebration of Teen Pregnancy Prevention Month is the foundations of resiliency. And we'll hear about ways that we can help build resiliency in our youth, as well as factors that can influence decision-making and positive outlooks for their futures. Our featured speaker is Dr. Horacio Sanchez, President and CEO of Resiliency, Inc. I'll tell you a little more about Dr. Sanchez shortly. He is recognized as one of the nation's prominent experts on promoting student resiliency and applying brain science to improve school outcomes. He is an agency leader in helping schools improve the school climate, instruction, and discipline. He is recognized as a prominent expert in applying brain science. He is part of the Maladaptive Council or Academy of Sciences, who recognizes him as a leading authority on emotional disorders and resiliency. He is a highly sought after speaker and has keynoted many national conferences. Thrilled that he's chosen to be with us today. He has been a teacher, administrator, clinician, mental health director, and consultant to the Department of Education in North Carolina and Pennsylvania and other states. His diverse education and background have helped him to merge this area of research, science, and practice. He is going to provide us with a dynamic presentation on how you can incorporate resiliency research into your programming and other youth service programs. So sit back, relax, and be challenged as he presents to us today. Dr. Sanchez, I'm going to turn it over to you. And keep your questions written down on a piece of paper, because at the end, we will be able to engage with Dr. Sanchez. So Dr. Sanchez, take it away.
Foundations of resiliency. Resiliency studies found risk factors that were associated with poor life outcomes. Poor life outcomes are natural outcomes like school failure, criminal involvement, substance abuse, mental health issues, things that any mother would not want for their child. What did we find out about risk factors? We found out that risk factors seem to impact the body, the mind, and emotional stability. Our risk is a risk is a risk. That was the first lesson we found out. And that was surprising to me, because I'd been conditioned to thinking that certain risk factors were worse than others. But that wasn't the case at all. What we found out was this: it wasn't which risk factor you had, but how many. Rudder determined that at 3 risk, you begin to be at risk. But every risk factor you have additionally increases the chances of poor life outcome. The other thing is risk factors snowball. The more you have, the more likely you are to have more. Lucky you. We now know that the more risk factors usually produces poor life outcome. Let me give you an example. In North Carolina, the most severe group ever tracked, the William population, the upper 2 percentile of severity, averaged 13.7 risk factors. Risk factors equal poor life outcomes. Here's a list of the risk factors found in resiliency research. It's not comprehensive, but it's most of them. What do we know about risk factors? We found out, hey, you can be born with some risk factors. Let me give you an example. You can be born with difficult temperament, and you just have it. Some risk factors you can get and then lose. For example, you can be failing in school and then start doing well at school, and it's gone. Some risk factors, once you have it, like sexual abuse. You can't be unabused. And some risk factors were perceptual in nature. That means if you thought you had it, the chemistry and the impact on the brain was the same. So example of those was a conflicted relationship with mom or dad seemed to be a risk factor that was perceptual in nature. It doesn't matter if your siblings didn't think so. It didn't matter if the parents didn't think so. As long as you thought it, it was there. Now, there was nothing surprising to you about the risk. And the reason is that you know risk. And here's why. All we've done all our history is study risk. I'm a clinician. When we did diagnosis, all we did was study risk. So we knew the risk. Resiliency was the first study that did this. It looked to see what else happened to people at risk. And they found out some people had overwhelming risk and should have had poor life outcomes, were still having good life outcomes. They were doing well with relationships. They were doing well with jobs. They were finishing school. They were avoiding criminal involvement. They were avoiding substance abuse. And they were called the resilient population. And the resilient population had a few things happen. One, we found out that they had to have enough protective factors to balance the scale. You have 3 risk, you need some protectives. You have 10 risk, you need a whole lot more. But there was something else that came out. Every person who was naturally resilient, they were able to identify a universal protective factor, a long-term nurturing relationship with at least one adult, the universal protective factors. Here's a list of the protective factors found in resiliency research. It's not comprehensive, but close. What did we learn about protective factors? One, we found out that they were the same as risk factors. Some you can be born with, some you can get and lose, some once you have it, and some were perceptual in nature. I point you to a few interesting ones. One, independent-minded girl is the only protective factor that is gender specific. Independent-minded girls tend to have less issues with teen pregnancy and substance abuse. There are 2 indicators that were consistently found in independent-minded girls. One, they did good at school. Not necessarily A's and B's necessarily, but they were good enough students, but also they navigated the institution of school well and thrived in the institution. 2, they were involved in structured extracurricular activities, sports, choir, maybe they were practicing piano consistently, something. And it seemed to make the girls stronger, and independent-minded girls were less likely to get involved in premature sex or teen pregnancy. There's another section of protective factors that were interesting. They seem to reduce the risk of at-risk behavior. For kids who were highly at risk, who did not engage in at-risk behavior, they fell under the category of hope and expectation for the future. The first one was the adolescent actively planning for their future. And apparently, if they're actively planning, consistently doing things for the future, that was helpful. And that seemed to give birth to realistic expectations. And realistic is not low expectations. It could be any kind of expectations, but the plan had to be good enough plan to make those expectations a reality. And the last thing was, once those 2 things were present, the person had the feeling of control over their life and that is helpful. Why would that reduce at-risk behavior? Here's what we found out. At-risk behavior puts the brain in survival mode, and the brain in survival mode focuses on one thing, the present, reacting to the present. But when you have hope and expectation returned, what you're able to do is this, plan and see the future, see the consequences of our behavior, see the impact of life, and that ability reduces at-risk behaviors. Let me give you an example of a longitudinal resiliency study. Amy Warner tracked everybody born in the island of Kauai in 1955. She tracked that cohort from birth to age 32. That's longitudinal. When she tracked the cohort, over 600 kids born, she tracked them and she found out, oh my God, the ones with the most risk factors had the most poor outcomes. However, in that group with high risk, 1/3 of the children had enough protective factors, and those protective factors were consistently seen, and when people got those protective factors, they overcame the risk in their life. So the rule is pretty simple. Protective factors seem to improve your body and your physical health. You say, how can protective factors improve physical health? Here's one of the things we found out. Risk increased stress. Stress causes premature aging. It improved the brain. We found every protective factor you add improves the chemistry and function and even structures of your brain. And it also improves our emotional stability because it reduces mental illness. Neuroscience identified the foundations of resiliency. Which protective factors might be the most important for people who struggle to be resilient, who are highly at risk? And why are these protective factors the foundation? Because they impact chemistry. They make us chemically more balanced. It's called homeostasis. And when we become chemically more balanced, we are now in a way where we can function better and have a better chance of gaining more protectives. First, protective factor for helping individuals who are not naturally resilient to promote resiliency is ritualized anchor points. Ritualized anchor points. For you to understand this, you have to understand temperament. What is temperament? Temperament is your neurobiological response to stimuli. You see, we process chemically, and we go up when we process and we return. Temperament also tells us how we manage stress and cope with stress. And some people rebound from stress faster. Temperament also tells us that we can rebound from trauma quicker. So individuals with certain temperaments are just healthier and have an easier time. Easy temperament individuals tend to eat better, sleep better, and read people better. You say, eat and sleep? Well, eating and sleeping are your first indicators of how well you manage stress. Think about it. Every time you've ever been stressed in your life, truly, what is the first thing that's impacted? Eating and sleeping. Average temperament folks seem to do pretty well with eating and sleeping and reading people as long as the rituals are good in their life. But there are people with difficult temperament or shy and anxious temperament which were born with an inability to manage stress and don't rebound from trauma well, and they struggle with eating and sleeping from the very beginning, and they don't read people well. These temperaments, although they seem very similar, display themselves differently. For example, difficult temperament, when overwhelmed, tends to act out. Shy and anxious temperament, when overwhelmed, tends to internalize. One of these temperaments, when overwhelmed, can't get out of bed. The other temperament can't get to sleep. One of them can't stop eating. The other one loses their appetite. Eating and sleeping always impacted. Why is eating and sleeping so important to your natural temperament? By the way, temperament is not hereditary. It is act of God and random. That means in your family you could have what? A kid with easy temperament and a person with difficult temperament in the same family. So why is this so important? Well, we found out that eating and sleeping is in the same part of the brain that is crucial for creating habits. It's called the nucleus accumbens, or we can also call it the reward pathway. We found out about the reward pathway by natural drive behaviors: eating, sleeping, sex. All of these are natural drive behaviors. Why are they natural drive behaviors? For the continuation of the human race. Man has to eat to survive. So brain did this. It reinforced it with dopamine. Every time you ate, dopamine secreted, and that dopamine secretion gave you motivation so you can go after food. Why would you need that? Because primitive man had to overcome struggles to eat, and without the dopamine motivation, guess what? He may not have done it. The other thing we know is sex has to do with the continuation of the human race. It's the only survival drive that is time limited, unless you take a little blue pill. So, let's consider this a little bit more closely. Some of you are saying, even if I know that I have to eat to survive, do I really need dopamine? Because if I know I need to eat to survive, wouldn't I continue eating regardless of the dopamine reinforcement? The answer is probably no. Let me give you an example. We looked at girls who were at risk of anorexia, which is an imaging disorder. And there are certain things different about their brains. One of the things we found out was different is that most people secreted this much dopamine when they ate. These girls, from the beginning, they secreted this much. They had lower levels of dopamine secretion. The other difference was the part of the brain called the insula that helps you understand and have an accurate perception of the world was distorted. That means when you stand in front of the mirror and see yourself, if your insula doesn't work well, you see things slightly different than everyone else. Those were the two things different about these young ladies. So what ends up happening with people who have this low drive and an altered insula is this. They oftentimes have a misperception of who they are. These young ladies have also often said that they can't talk to friends or family because when they go to mom and dad go, what? Oh, you're such a pretty young, you're great, don't worry. They go to their friends, oh, you're great, you look great, don't worry. And they feel different about themselves than everyone else. So they have no place to go for comfort. They have no place to go for understanding. In today's world, when you have no place to go for comfort and understanding, where do you go? Ah, the internet. So she's surfing the web, she's looking around, she's reading for other issues that can help her understand herself better, and she comes across this person and their dossier talks about how they felt about themselves and what they did to take care of their life, and she goes, oh my God, that's it. That's exactly how I feel. And she's reading, and this person tells her one of the things she did to take care of her life and get control was purging, the bringing up of your food after you eat and not getting caught. And she tells her all about it and how the best strategies to do it, and she now starts a new behavior, purging after eating. So she eats, she gets her dopamine. She purges, she gets no dopamine. But after about 2 weeks, guess what started happening? She started getting in front of the mirror, seeing herself differently, and for the first time, it seemed to help. And now, purging became valuable. And a valuable thing gets reinforced by dopamine. And now, guess what happened? She ate, she got dopamine. And she purged, she got a little. Then she kept on purging, and she kept on feeling better about herself. And guess what started to happen? She'll eat, she'll get dopamine. She'll purge, she'll get a little more. She'll eat, she'll get dopamine. She'll purge, she'll get a little more. Then an interesting thing started to happen. She'll eat, she'll get less. She'll purge, she'll get more. She'll eat, she'll get even less. She'll purge, she'll get even more. She'll eat, she'll get barely any. And at that time, we had to hospitalize her. Why? Because she hadn't stopped. She stopped eating. Now, I go visit her on the ward. I sit next to her bed, and I ask her, don't you know you have to eat to survive? And what does she tell me? Yes. Then why aren't you eating? I don't know. You see, the drive of dopamine seems to be very important for certain behaviors to actually be valued. The difference between her and someone who's genetically at risk of obesity was this. A person genetically at risk of obesity secretes low dopamine when they eat, but have no issues with the insula. And for those individuals, guess what happens? When they eat the right amount to get dopamine, what ends up happening is the brain starts to shift. And instead of when you're full, your thalamus says, hey, you're full, guess what happens? They don't get dopamine. So they have to eat past the amount of being full to to get the dopamine. And every time they do that, the brain keeps on adjusting, and then they have to go past more. Then the brain adjusts, then they have to go past more. And every time that happens, we found out this. They had to keep on eating more and more to get the dopamine reinforcement. So, dopamine reinforcement is crucial for creating habits, and it's crucial for our system. It is a transmitter that all of us need to feel more chemically balanced and good. This part of the brain is also involved with addiction. What is addiction to human brain? Addiction to human brain is this: a spike of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens followed by a drop. That is addiction. Let me explain. Every addictive substance binds itself to the neurotransmitter dopamine and causes a flood in the nucleus accumbens followed by a drop. So let's consider the world. We have a small section of people here who have a high secreting dopamine system. All their life, they secrete it extremely well. For these individuals, they can create new habits very easily. Wonderful thing. A large section of the world secretes fairly well. And a small section of the world secretes very poorly in the nucleus accumbens. So we're young and we're free, and we go to a party. Someone lights up a joint. The folks with their high secreting systems, they take a hit. The folks with their average secreting systems, they take a hit. And the folks with their sucky secreting systems, they take a hit. I know you're saying, he's doing that too well. Now, what happened here? When these folks took a hit, they did not feel a spike because they've secreted high all their life. As a matter of fact, they didn't feel any. They were the folks faking like they got high at the party, not going to be users. The folks over here got a little bump, recreational, see you next Saturday night. But the folks over here got spike. Oh, wait a second. Something happened on the way to spike. There was a moment there where they finally had the dopamine levels that was normative, and they felt normal, followed by euphoria, then drop. Screw next Saturday night. They're hitting it and hitting it and hitting. The brain is plastic, so the brain will do this. We're making too much dopamine. We're making too much dopamine. And the brain will start cutting back on the little dopamine it was making, causing this person to do what? Hit it more. And they hit it more and more, the brain cuts back. Hit it more and more, the brain comes back. And they get to the level with that substance where they're no longer hitting it to feel a high or euphoria. They're just hitting it to avoid depression and feeling sad. At that moment, they have a decision. Step up or step off. Step up to another drug, more potent, or step off completely. That's where the concept of gateway drug comes from. So I want you to understand this. Why is this important to you? One, addiction doesn't have to do with moral fiber, does it? Or character or strength. There are some people in the world that the moment they touch a substance, addiction is instantaneous. And for those individuals, it is there. And you need to understand that, because one of the things that hinders treatment is that people feel insecure or vulnerable or not healthy because of their addiction. You may ask, well, can the people in the average range get addicted? Yes. It usually takes some kind of significant event, and they have to abuse longer, and they can cross over. What about these folks over here? Can they get addicted? Yeah, it usually takes a really significant event, and they have to usually abuse even longer. Now are you ready for the cruelest trick of all? Dopamine in your nucleus accumbens triggers in response to physical or emotional pain. So let's say we did a behavior that the consequence or the outcome of the behavior was physical or emotional pain. So let's say we all did this, and a person with their high secreting system, they did the behavior, the outcome, the terrible outcome was physical or emotional pain. In this case, it was emotional pain. They didn't feel it. They've always secreted high. The folks over here with the average systems, they did the behavior. The outcome caused them emotional pain. They didn't register because they've always secreted pretty well. But the folks over here with their low secreting systems, for many of them, the outcome to their negative behavior that caused them emotional pain gave them more dopamine than they get in their everyday behaviors. Now, the brain is chemical, not moral. I am not saying you're not moral. I'm saying the brain is chemical, not moral. So the brain has a drive to get the dopamine it's always needed. This person doesn't have healthy ways to get it. And even though they cognitively say to themselves, I do not want to do this behavior, guess what they do? They put themselves in situations where they do the behavior again to get their dopamine. So are you telling me that kids who consistently do behaviors that cause their life terrible outcomes and causes them a lot of misfortune and pain are addicted to the behavior? Yes, I am. Yes, I am. So what do we do? Well, you guys usually get on your white horse and ride in with your replacement behavior. Question, why does the horse always got to be white? Okay, I digress. So you get on your white horse, you come in with your replacement behavior. Now you have a relationship with this kid, and you say something like this. Come on, man, think about it. Every time you do this, look what it's cost you. It got you kicked out of home, got you kicked out of school. Oh my God, it's cost you nothing but trauma and pain. Instead of doing this, do this. And the kid trusts you, and he tries. And he stops doing the behavior for a while, and he's doing really well. And all of you are looking at him going, you're doing so well, you're doing so well, and we're so proud of you. But what's happening inside? Before he, chemically imbalanced, was doing certain behaviors that got him some dopamine. But now he's doing a new behavior, and he's doing really well to the outside world, but he doesn't get the dopamine he was getting before. So inside, he's actually feeling worse and worse, and it's building, and it's building, and it's building, and he blows up and does the old behavior. Don't worry. You guys get back on your white horse and ride in again, right? Oh man, you were doing so good. Come on, man, let's try again. And he tries it. And it builds, and it builds, and it builds, and he blows up and does the old thing again. And you ride in, and he does it again, and you ride in, and he does it again. And after a while of failure after failure after failure, if he has the modicum of sense, he wakes up one morning and says this, maybe I can't. Maybe I'm just no good. And in that moment, he's crossed over to the dark side. He has quit on even trying. So some of you are saying, well, that means some of the things we were doing for kids to try to help them, for adolescents to try to help them, actually was hurting them. Technically, yeah, but you're not responsible for that, and here's why. You did not know any better. So the question was asked, well, can't we design behaviors to trigger dopamine? And I said, sure! Dopamine can be triggered in the nucleus accumbens by low electrical current. So we can stick this probe in your head and pulse it a little, and voila! But every time we do this, you get pissed off. So we had to figure out another way. And here's what the science said about designing interventions that actually trigger dopamine. One, we have to teach actions. And the actions have to be taught in sequential patterns. That means you repeat the same steps. Why? Well, apparently the brain values sequential patterns. Let me show you how much it values it. For us to remember something, usually our hippocampus has to do it, remember it, and it has to repeatedly state it to the prefrontal cortex over and over for a long-term memory to be designed. We looked at folks with retrograde amnesia. That means folks that can't remember anything the next day. If you've seen the movie 50 First Dates, you got the idea. Now, they found folks with retrograde amnesia can't make a new memory, but can still learn a new procedure, because the brain values procedures so valuable that no matter what else is wrong with your brain, oftentimes that is still insulated. You've got to teach actions that have sequential steps. Two, you've got to make the action valuable to the amygdala. The amygdala has three natural values. The need to be safe, the need to be successful, the need to be wanted. Now, if you can make a person believe the action is going to make them more successful or going to make them safer, guess what? It gets into the amygdala. Why is that important? We found out when you get overwhelmed and emotional, there's a period of time when you're emotionally high. Your prefrontal cortex slowly disconnects for a period, and the only thing you have in the most crucial emotional times to make a decision is your amygdala. What is in your amygdala is oftentimes predictive of what you'll do. So getting the behavior in the amygdala is crucial. 2, having a trigger. We found out that people having some kind of cue to trigger the behavior helps the brain anticipate the behavior, and having a consistent time to practice the behavior is crucial. Why is that important? We think it has to do with mirror neurons. Mirror neurons say that mirror neurons play a film of a pattern that is predictable. So we found out this. If you have a consistent, predictable time to do a behavior, the mirror neuron will do this. Play it right before to influence human behavior. And then what do all the professionals supporting the new behavior have to do? Help the adolescent recognize when they're doing it successfully. And you say, when they know that? We found out that's not the case. Oftentimes people who struggle don't even know when they're doing well because they're conditioned to only looking at when they're doing poorly. So why are rituals so important in our lives? We found out rituals heal us. We found out that the kids over here with difficult or shy and anxious temperament, if they're born to homes that were structured and had good rituals, get what we found? Healing to the brain. People who struggle with dopamine often have damage to the DRD2 receptors. We found out those receptors started to heal, that we found out you can actually improve brain function enough, and rituals seem to do that. Let me give you an example. Here's one of my favorite research studies ever done. A group of researchers from Harvard went to one of the largest prisons in the United States. And they went to the warden and said, hey, we'd like to do a research study. The warden said, what do you want to do? They said, well, we want to wake up prisoners with human interaction, avoiding conflict. We want to serve the main meal of the prison day. And at the end of the day, we want to return and process with each of the prisoners. The warden said, well, what's that going to do? They said, well, we don't know. But they had so much money, the warden said, go on with your bad self. So they assigned a case manager, a group of prisoners, and the case manager's job was to wake the prisoners up with human interaction every morning. They gave a huge grant to a culinary arts school to serve the main meal of the prison day. And at the end of the day, the case manager came back and said what? How's your day? Is there anything bothering you? Is there anything you want to talk about? And if they did, they talked. And if not, they said good night. They did this for 1 year. The data in the prisons were astounding. The use of prison chapel went up. The use of prison library went up. Minor infractions went down. Major infractions went down. So at the end of the first year, they returned to the warden year 2, and they said, hey, we want to do it again. Add one component, a rap session right after the main meal. The warden was so happy with what's happening in his prison, he said, go on with your bad self. So the case manager came up and woke the prisoner up with human interaction. The culinary arts school served an amazing meal. And after the meal, the case manager sat down with everyone in the caseload to discuss whatever was on their mind. What did they talk about? Anything within reason. You couldn't talk about shanking someone, but anything within reason. And after that, the case manager returned in the evening to process again. How's your day? Is there anything you want to talk about? If not, good night. Data was consistent again. Chapel use, up. Library use, up. Minor infractions, down. Major infractions, down. And my buddies ended the study and they wrote one of the most phenomenal papers ever published. This was the first study that identified that prisoners were victims of physical and or sexual abuse, a majority of them. Where did they find this out? In the rap sessions. Why is this significant? Because in prison, showing a weakness is a risk and could get you killed. Something happened in the prison climate that made everybody feel a little bit safer and made them feel better. Well, a good friend of mine was the lead researcher, and I got a preprint of the paper, and I read it on the airplane, got off the plane, called him. It's great stuff. And I told him all the stuff I loved, and I said, there's one thing I think you guys missed that was crucial. And I told him you might have missed that the most significant thing you did was create rituals that anchored the prisoner's day. Because the most important rituals we know for our neurobiology is wake up, main meal, and bedtime. And I told him, and he was really pissed off, and he said, "Screw you, Ross," and he cut off. Okay. So I'm a clinician by nature, so I took an oath to do no harm. So on the anniversary of the publication for 10 years, I would call him and go, "You still missed it," and he'll go, "Still screw you." We had a ritual. End of year 10. I called him and I said, "You still missed it." And he goes, "You might have been right." And I was pissed off. I said, "This is not the way we play the game." Here's what happened. The folks across the street from him, because at that time Harvard had the largest brain institute of all universities, and they said, "Those guys might have been right." Let me explain to you what happens. We found out rituals make you feel better chemically because they give you dopamine reinforcement. Because doing any kind of pattern does that. Why is the wake up, main meal, and bedtime so crucial? One, when you wake up in the morning, your brain gives you an extra dose of cortisol to jumpstart your immune system. No big deal for most people. People with easy temperaments, guess what? A little bit of cortisol, no big deal. Average temperaments, no big deal. But people with difficult or anxious temperament, it actually overwhelms them. We found out everyone gets to balance quicker and starts their day off better with a ritual. Main meal. Do you know when you sit down and have a main meal that is predictable, that means it's the same time with people and you have a social conversation, your brain produces oxytocin. Oxytocin is a bonding hormone, which means what? You will get closer to people that you eat with. But guess what else also happens? When oxytocin goes up, guess what comes down? Cortisol, stress. So your main meal, when it's predictable and has social components, reduces the stress in your life. If you have a ritual for going to bed, we found out what? You get into REM quicker. Why is that important? One, when you get into REM, deep sleep, your brain can remember things, memory improves, it reinforces the memory things you learned that day. Your brain will also make sophisticated connections, solve problems. But here's the other thing that's crucial for you. Your brain does maintenance on the brain. It recalibrates when you sleep. And we know this for a few reasons. One, it produces a protein that enables synapses to grow, and synapses enables your brain to make connections, and that's crucial for a healthy brain. It also does this. It produces a fluid that flushes all the toxins out of the brain to cleanse and make your brain work better. That's why when you've had multiple days without sleep, what starts to happen? You get foggy, you don't remember well, you don't make good decisions because your brain is not optimal. Rituals are the anchor points of our days, and rituals are crucial for doing things. Neuroscience found out that people who have rituals, guess what? They manage stress better and they bounce back from trauma quicker. One of the foundations of resiliency is to have good rituals in your life to improve your homeostasis. Step 2, promote social comfort. Promote social comfort, because we have to go after what? Relationships, because everyone who became resilient had long-term relationships with at least one adult. For you to understand this, you have to understand how your brain works. And you have to understand how we respond to emotional experiences in our life. The first part of the brain that you have to understand is the amygdala. The amygdala is part of the limbic system. That's the primary brain, the primitive brain, one of the oldest parts of the brain that does automated reactions. Your amygdala is in charge of your emotions. The amygdala is an action system. It is not a thought system. Then whenever the amygdala is impacted, there is some action. The amygdala is in charge of reading and producing nonverbal emotional expressions when under stress. So let me put it this way. Every person, when they become emotional, does things with their face, hands, posture, gestures, and the tone of their voice. And they'll do it automatically. For example, most of you, when you were little kids, the first time you got pissed off, you made a face. Even as a baby, you made some kind of face that showed the world what? That you're pissed off. Did your mother sit you down and tell you how to make a pissed off face? No, it was chemical. It happened. The chemistry in your brain says this, you were feeling pissed off, and the amygdala took over the face to show the emotion. When you're really happy, it takes over your face to show the emotion. It takes over your gestures. That's why people are pissed off, make more gestures. When people are happy, they make more gestures. It takes over your posture. It takes over your voice tone. That's why many people elevate in voice tone when they get upset. Well, we know this. When you're calm, you're in full control of your face, your hands, your posture, your gesture. But when you get upset, the amygdala takes that over. That means people who are more upset all the time have facial expressions, body postures, gestures that show the world how they are feeling. The amygdala is also the pharmacist of the brain. Whenever you have an emotional crisis, it is the amygdala that takes over the response, puts it in your blood system so you act. Your amygdala has 3 natural values, 3 drives: the need to feel safe, the need to feel loved, and the need to be successful. Out of these 3 values, one of them seems to be more universal than the other. We found out that people have sociopathic tendencies, or sociopaths, don't have the desire to feel love because they don't have desire to build relationship. We found people who are psychopaths don't feel fear, so they don't have to feel safe. But the drive for every person that still stays is the need to be successful. So you're telling me a good sociopath and psychopath wants to be a good sociopath and psychopath? Yeah, they want to be as most successful as possible. Your amygdala is in charge of your emotional memories. It stores your emotional memories. So the best of things that ever happened to you and the worst things that ever happened to you are in your amygdala. Your amygdala holds your values and your beliefs. That means your values and beliefs all come out of emotions, not cognitive process. The amygdala is alerted to differences because anything that's different can harm you. But one of the things that makes the amygdala calm down is to find out that we have something in common with each other. On the other side of the equation is your prefrontal cortex, the most evolved, latest evolved part of the human brain. It's in charge of logic, functioning, good decision making, all that great stuff. Our cortex has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and more effective and more profound and has evolved. We have the most advanced cortex in the world compared to any other creature. Our cortex grew because of 2 things. The first thing that allowed the cortex to have a big explosion was civilization. When man got into clans and clans started creating rules and daily life became predictable, guess what? The amygdala was always alert to keep us alive. Guess what? It got offline and our cortex, boom, growth. The other growth of the cortex happened with the introduction of language, formal learning. That seemed to have another big growth to the cortex because learning really helps the brain grow and do better. And those 2 things now makes us have the most advanced cortex of any other creature. And one of the jobs of our cortex is to do this, to exercise control over our amygdala, our emotions, our impulses. So you get a new job. Your new supervisor comes in and changes a bunch of stuff. You get kind of pissed off. Your amygdala might say, slap her! But your cortex is strong enough to keep you under control and says, not a good idea. You need the job. You need the money. Calm down. However, although we have the most advanced cortex than any other creature on the face of the earth, and our amygdala is small in comparison, it still has clout. You see, when we get emotionally overwhelmed, our amygdala secretes a hormone that temporarily cuts off interference from the cortex so it can create an action. What will the amygdala base our actions on? Well, currently, it's the best of things and the worst of things. But it's not equable, is it? Let's say this person grew up in a household where they didn't experience trauma. They had so many good experiences and values are in their amygdala. The worst thing they ever saw is occasionally their mom and dad argued a little loud voice. This other person has been exposed to some of the most heinous traumas and abuse and neglect that anyone has ever seen. Both of these people are in front of me, and I stress them both. Their cortex gets cut off. Their amygdalas react. But this person in their amygdalas, guess what? They have values and they have behaviors that were taught from good experiences that still mitigates their emotional response, and probably the worst I see from them is some attitude. But this person who's seen some of the ugliest things demonstrates the ugliest things they've ever seen. This starts to explain to us why. This started to explain to us why we have to get new behaviors into the amygdala. The other thing we found out is that people who've been traumatized over and over again get a hypersensitive amygdala that tends to overreact quickly and even misinterpret benign help as aggression. As a result, until we get people more chemically balanced, their chances of doing better is lower. Now, what happens when we meet people for the first time? Are you aware that you scan every person you encounter in milliseconds? Milliseconds. That means you're not consciously aware of it, but it's already happened. We scan everyone visually in basically 1 to 200 milliseconds. There are 1,000 milliseconds in a second. It happens quickly and it's completely subconscious. I mean, it's happened and you're not aware. So when you're passing anyone or coming into a crowded room, even when you don't think you're looking at folks, guess what's happening? Your amygdala is reading them and your insula is predicting their behavior. So we navigate the world like this. We read and we predict. We read and we predict. We read and we predict. Why would we do that? Because nature wanted us to be able to identify people who are safe quickly and people who are avoided quickly. Wow. When we looked at adolescents who were prone to violating social norms, we found out something interesting. Their amygdalas tended to read and misread, and their insulas tended to stay fairly dormant. So when they navigated the world, it went like this. I misread you, and I can't predict what you're going to do. I misread you, I can't predict what you're going to do. I misread you, I can't predict what you're going to do. So for anyone like this, guess what starts to happen? They start to treat every person they encounter as what? A threat until they're certain. And if you think everyone is a threat, guess what your amygdala will do? It'll take over your face, your hands, your posture, your gestures, and your tone of voice to keep people away. We found out people with more difficult temperament tend to put on more aggression to keep people away. People with shy and anxious temperament tend to put on odd behaviors to keep people away. By the way, it's not that they can't read anyone. The amygdala is attracted to itself. That means they can read who? Others who are just like them. But that means they're only able to read the least healthy people who are around them and not be able to connect to the people who are healthy. Your amygdala is alerted to differences and eased by commonality. When you get back to work or getting with a group, I want you to do this exercise. The exercise is pretty simple. I want you to see what happens when the amygdala is aware of things we share in common. Even the silliest things, if we are aware that we share them in common, calms the amygdala and makes you feel better. Here's an exercise I do with groups all the time. I tell them, stand up and say this phrase. I knew I liked you for some reason. Then have them all sit down and we're going to show a series of things. And I tell people, if you like it, stand up, look for someone else who's standing up, high five them and say, what? I knew I liked you for some reason. All we want you to do is see what happens when the amygdala recognizes commonality. See how happy you feel. Stand if you like pizza. High five someone and say, I knew I liked you for some reason. Stand if you like music. High five someone and say, I knew I liked you for some reason. Stand if you like movies. High five someone and say, I knew I liked you for some reason. Stand if you like diamonds. High five someone and say, I knew I liked you for some reason. Stand if you like sports. High five someone and say, I knew I liked you for some reason. Now, you need to understand, as silly as that sounds, we know how important it is. They did studies on social comfort, and one of the largest studies on social comfort was done in one of the most segregated settings on the face of the earth, high schools. No, really, stand in the hallway of any high school, and I bet you'll see amygdala drawing people together based on commonalities. Oh, they're the athletes all together. Oh, they're the popular girls. Oh my goodness, the nerds. The amygdala drawing people together. So the researchers looked for schools that had a history of conflict between certain groups that have been consistent over a 10-year period. That means the groups always had incidents and every year always occurred. Okay. They went to these schools and they tried to do a thing to determine what will happen if you improved commonalities. Now, how did they get here? They started with this. They did an experiment with folks who had a strong dislike for a group of people based on some factor like the color of their skin or their culture or their religion. They'll brought them in, hook them up to fMRI, and they'll ask them a series of questions. And here's what they found. What's supposed to happen if I ask you a didactic kind of question? What is the capital of North Carolina? We should see activity in your prefrontal cortex. If I ask you an emotional question like, how are you coping with your grandfather's death? I should see activity in your amygdala. Here's what they found out. Anyone who had a hatred for another person based on a factor like color of skin or culture, no matter what they asked related to that group, there was an amygdala response. I'll tell you an actual question for the study. They said, do you think those people put on their pants one leg at a time? And guess what they saw? Amygdala. Are you kidding me? That's not even an emotional question. They found out overreaction of the amygdala has to do with conflict and poor social interaction. So the question was asked, can we improve that by improving the calmness of the amygdala? And the way to improve the calmness of the amygdala is to let people know what they have in common. So they went to these high schools that had history of patterns between groups, and they set up research studies. Now, they were smart not to just pick one kind of conflict. So in the study, there are things that you can anticipate. Black versus white, gang versus gang. But in one of the schools, the conflict was between the rich kids and the poor kids. In another one of the schools, the conflict was with kids who came from the farm and the kids who lived in the city. And here's what they did. They set up the schedule so half the school population only saw each other during the day, the other half only saw each other. One half they did nothing for, the other half had teachers who gave them some activities at the beginning of the year that had all the kids find out what they had in common with the other students. But that wasn't the only thing. After they did those activities, they had other activities that they did that required physical cooperation, but they grouped them based on what they had in common. So they artificially created groups because they all liked the same thing, kids that would naturally not be with each other, and they had to do a physical activity to cooperate. Why a physical activity? It has to do with embodied cognition. We found out the brain likes to anchor abstract concepts to concrete things. Hey, cooperation is abstract. If I can do it physically, cooperate with someone physically, guess what? My brain understands the concept quicker. That's why they did it. So they did 3 activities so everyone in the class was able to interact with everyone in the class, and they always drawn together because of what they have in common, and they looked back and looked at the data. And here's what they saw. For the group that they did nothing for, they had the same old setting, the incidence levels were the same. In this other group, the lowest drop was 44%. Wow. That is clear that the conflict happens when we focus on differences before commonalities. Here are some examples of what was done in the student survey. And I wanted you to look at some of the questions so you can notice something. That none of the questions were important. Because in something like this, you don't ask questions like, what is your greatest value and what is your religions, and because those are things that are emotional that can cause conflict. They ask simple things that where the difference would not be a big deal, but the commonalities make the amygdala happy. This concept of instantaneously reading someone, some of you don't buy it. I'll give you an example. Thin slice studies. In thin slice studies, what they did was this. Thin slice studies were done at major universities across the United States. And if you were at one of these universities, you might have gotten this letter, And if you're in the community around the university or at the university, the letter would say, hey, we're doing a research study to see if we can improve the interaction between people who are different cultures, different races. It's 1 hour of your time. It's not intrusive, no needles. And for your time, we'll give you $100. So the day of the study happens, all these people come into an auditorium. They say, thank you for coming. They give them some minor instructions. And they say, listen, I'd like you to watch this video. They turn off the lights and they show a 30-second video of a professor. The professor comes in, does what they do, 30 seconds, boom. Then right after the video, they turn on the lights and they pass out personality analysis booklets. And they say, could you please answer the questions in the booklets concerning the professor you just saw? Then they waited. Usually took less than 2 minutes. And someone would say, excuse me, I'm sorry. I can't answer these questions. You're asking things about the person's character and ability, and I don't know anything. I just saw that 30-second clip. And they say, oh, thank you for asking. All we want you to do is guess, but promise us something, that you'll read each question very carefully, then guess. Okay? Okay. So all those assessments were gathered. At the end of the semester, they returned to every class of every professor in the study and said, hey, how would you students like to assess your professor's personality? Oh, we love to. So now you had people who were exposed to the professor for what? 1 complete semester. And you had other group of people that were exposed to what? 30 seconds. And then they compared what? The findings. And in study after study, done by different groups all over the United States, guess what happened? The findings were strikingly the same. Oh, what does that tell us? It tells us that there's something that we put out that everybody sees. Let me make sure you understand what I'm saying. When you walk around, what you present to the world is what all of us see and think of you. So they went back and they said, okay, why did some professors get really great ratings and why did others instantaneously have people dislike them so much? And they looked at the stuff, but they know that one thing could be familiarity, but they knew that wasn't it, because they found out if you were familiar with people who were different, your brain didn't react that much. If you admired someone who was different, your brain didn't react that much. At UNC and at Duke, they basically did this experiment. They said, okay, bring people in, hook them up to fMRI, and show them faces. And they found out what? Anytime the person was different than you, different race or culture, your amygdala reacted. But when people were just like you, your amygdala stayed calm. But there was one exception. If the person who was different than you was someone who was famous and you liked, or someone you famous or you admired, no reaction. So that's familiarity, but that didn't happen in these cases. So there was something else that happened that made people feel safe about the person that they were seeing for the first time, that made them have a positive expression. And then the researchers went back and looked at every tape and found out this. This was the number one thing they conferences. And before every conference, they'll bring all the keynoters in and they'll sit them down and say, hey guys, remember, if you smile more, you get better ratings. So here you go for my ratings. Okay, slide 2. The brother in drag. I put that in there for a reason. That picture was used in a bias study. They looked at a bunch of guys who had a strong bias for someone who would dress like that. And they'll bring them into a room and they'll have hidden recording and they'll play faces. When that exact picture came up, you would usually hear chuckling and little jokes and remarks. If you go to Getty Images, you can see that same picture with the same guy in the same garb, but this time he has a cigar in his mouth, looking forward, looking serious. And when they use that picture, and they showed the faces. When it got to that picture, they recorded the most heinous comments you ever want to hear. Well, all the groups had the same level of bias against guys who addressed that. What was the difference? Because when he was smiling, his difference wasn't a threat. But when he wasn't, it was a threat. Well, here's the part in our talk that people who tend to be grumpy tend to elbow someone next to them and say something like this. Just because I don't smile on the outside doesn't mean I'm not happy on the inside. Yes, it does. The science is clear. Yes, it does. So we found out that those individuals who struggle to connect to people, remember, shy and anxious temperament, difficult temperament, but actually more and more people are struggling to connect. We found out we just couldn't leave them. So we started to teach students how to connect, and we taught them how to do what? The first impression is important because the brain does what? Establishes a lot of things in the first impression. So we taught people to smile, to introduce themselves, ask their name, ask the other person their name, and then ask them some questions, and the moment they had something in common, to connect to it. By the way, that's why some of the most skilled people in the world do, by the way. Think about it. Some of the most skilled social people can meet a bunch of people, talk to them, make them feel safe, and connect to things. And what happens when that happens? People are elated. I travel a lot. I go to a lot of places. I speak to a lot of folks, and guess what? If we get on something we both like, I'm sitting there at this table with a bunch of administrators at this conference, and someone says, oh, you went to Duke. I love Duke basketball. And they start talking, and we start talking instantaneous like. Have you ever seen the opposite? Someone who disrespects what you like instantaneously? They go like, well, you like that? Well, oh, yeah, I really do. Well, I liked it till I grew up. Well, screw you too. Differences causes the amygdala to get alerted and angry. If you focus on commonalities, it makes the amygdala calm down. Now, some of you are saying, well, we have to deal with differences. Yeah, you're right, we do. But we found out this. If you don't deal with commonalities first, when you deal with differences first, you create dissension and tension. If you deal with commonalities first and then address differences, guess what? It improves. Well, resiliency studies told us what? People who are naturally resilient made a relationship with other people. Great. But we also told you there are people who struggle to build relationships. And we found out unless you teach them skills, how to get in there, how to introduce themselves, how to calm the other people's amygdala down, how to make connections to commonalities, they couldn't get to those relationships. All people needed those skills, and once they develop skills and they practice, guess what? Making connections with people who are more different is easier, and then they make connections to people who can help them, and their social network gets healthier, and guess what they get? Oxytocin, which makes them bond better and be more chemically balanced, making them healthier. 2, promote social comfort. Step 3, build competencies. Build competencies. Every competence increases brain function, but it does a whole lot more. When I was director of Wake County Mental Health, we created the first resiliency-based mental health treatment center in public sector. And we didn't hedge bets, guys. We did it with the most severe of the population. We did it with the upper 2 percentile, the willing population that we had. And the matter of fact, everyone started to follow our approach. And here's what we did. We put all of these kids who were out of the homes into single family homes, just but one person. And we said to the parents, build relationships and try to promote protective factors that happen in the home. We also said if something happens, we swooped in there with a crisis team, we separated them, we gave them one night apart, then we came and counseled them back together and repaired before anything happened, and we just kept the relationship in place. We signed every client a mentor, and the mentor was supposed to do what? Build relationships and promote competencies. And then we had a crisis support team, and we just tracked and tracked and tracked. And here's what we found out. When relationships started stabilizing, and protective factors grew, regardless of presenting issues, the kids got better. But here was a catch. we found that building competencies was extremely slow. And we were wondering what was taking it so hard, because they're working so hard to build them and it wasn't seem to happen. Kids were quitting and quitting and quitting and quitting. When unbeknownst to us, competencies take focus. You see that part of your brain, prefrontal cortex, it exercises control over our emotions. It makes us more disciplined. And we were finding out that more and more kids couldn't stick with things. And one of the things we started tripping on was Moody at that time was doing a research study at Harvard, and Moody's study basically told us this, that there may be an issue with kids' ability to focus, and it was completely new. And she just tripped on it while doing another research study. So now we had a whole bunch of people studying what's happening with focus, and the new thing they found out was this. Multitasking with technology apparently may be inhibiting focus and reducing the prefrontal cortex ability to control the limbic system and your emotions. So one of the founding fathers of this research was Clifford Nas, and what have you listen to what he tells you about multitasking with technology and focus on the brain.
Just real briefly, multitaskers have many other problems. They can't pay attention, even when they want to. They are actually very poor at managing working memory. They find it very difficult to focus on writing, and they don't even multitask very well. Turns out people who multitask all the time are worse at it than people who never do it. Now you may wonder, what the heck is going on? What is their problem? Well, their problem lies in their brain. This is an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging scan of high and low multitaskers doing a task of switching from one task to another. That little white dot in the left prefrontal cortex is what we saw in everyone 20 years ago, and what we see in low multitaskers now. That's a part of the brain used for stopping decision making, etc. Okay? The yellow is what we see among high multitaskers, the extra brain power used by them when they are doing the same task. That actually is the visual cortex.
What we found out was many of our clients weren't developing competencies fast enough because they weren't able to focus. But then we found out that focus might be more important than we used to think. Focus is important for the health of the brain, for the brain to be actually healthy. We looked at folks who multitasked all the time and people who did single task activities for most of their adult life. And here's what we found out. You need 3 parts of your brain to be highly connected for you to age well. You need your prefrontal cortex, your parietal cortex, and your insula. They have to have strong connections for your brain to age and function well. When they studied folks, they found out people who maintain single task activities all throughout their adolescence and their adult life. Guess what happened? Their brains were healthier as they aged, and they were less risk of dementia, while the other folks were at higher risk. So we now know that focus is crucial for a healthy brain. We now know focus is important for your brain to perform well, If you have a task that you want to achieve, you need focus to do it. They did a research study with Marines, and they broke them up into 2 groups prior to deployment. One group they didn't do anything with, the other group they did focus exercises. They did 8 weeks, 12 minutes. Now, here's what happened. After they deployed them, they tracked them. And the folks that did focus exercise, guess what they had? Better memory, better mood stability. They had less breakdowns, less issues of PTSD. And guess what? They also perform better, especially under pressure. For you to be the best you can be, for you to perform at your highest level, guess what you have to have? The ability to focus. And then we found out focus is important for your emotional brain to be stable. We looked at folks who had a reoccurrence of depression multiple times, and we found out that they were highly at risk of coming back with depression. They took people who had multiple cases and put them into 2 groups. They gave both groups the same treatment, but this group they added focus, and guess what they found out? Less cases of reoccurrence. We found out all emotional issues require a level of focus to overcome it. Anxiety is more stabilized with a brain that's able to focus. Phobias, fears, depression require focus to overcome. So focus is required for a healthy brain more than ever. So We had to teach individuals how to focus. So we started training our clients how to focus, and we gave them quick drills for basically no more than 1 minute every single day. So I'm going to do some focus activities with you. Just watch the screen, focus carefully, and see if you get the answer right at the end. First one, keep your eye on the ace of spades. Keep focus until the cards stop moving. Okay, under which card is the ace of spades? I hope you got it right. So once kids got good at some of the exercises, we made them, instead of making them longer, we made them faster. This one isn't a fast one. This is just a little bit faster than the last one, and it has another trick. It has something you have to discount or ignore, as well as the things you have to focus on. So we're going to increase speed to increase focus. Remember the phrase that appears. The words will be in yellow or red. They'll make a sentence. Keep your focus until you see the punctuation. That's a period. What is the phrase? The ability to focus is the key to accomplishing great things. How many of you got every word right and also saw the punctuation? That's a period. 10 years ago, the rate of accuracy was much higher than today because of the lack of focus. By the way, I am not trying to put technology back in a box. I want you to live better with technology, and here's 3 things I want you to consider doing to make your brain healthier to focus. 1, stay unplugged 1 hour a day. Unplugged means unplugged. You don't even look at your phone during that 1 hour, and no, it does not count when you're sleeping. You need an hour unplugged. 2, you need to improve your focus because most of us have issues with focus because we're multitasking all the time. And 3, have some activity in your life that you do regularly that's single task. So let's say you go jogging 3 days a week for 45 minutes, wonderful, single task. However, if you go jogging with headphones on playing music, it's no longer single task. Single task is single task. So, what does this have to do with competencies? Here's what we found out. Most of our kids didn't have the strength of the prefrontal cortex to have the discipline to start and to finish something correctly. They started and they quit. They started and they quit. And you don't understand something. When you do something new, the early part is tough. It is difficult. It requires some grit and focus and strength of the brain to stay disciplined. And if you don't have the discipline and the focus to do it, you start and you quit, you start and you quit, you start and you quit. But there's another catch. Do you know there's a part of your brain that never turns off? It's your subconscious brain. And your subconscious brain gives you messages all the time based on your experiences. And here's what we found out. People who start and quit, start and quit, start and quit, fail, 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 fail. When you start something new, guess what? Your subconscious brain is constantly telling you what? You're going to quit. But we found out people who started and finished, and got more successful, their subconscious brain started to tell them what? It's a tough time. Just get over it. You'll get through it. Push through. You'll be successful. And that was the pattern that was needed. So we started with small competencies told the kids the importance of starting and finishing. And then as they built and they built, they gained more and more and more, and it made the body, the mind, and their emotional stability better. 3, build competencies. If you want to follow me on social media, here are my social media sites. I give brain facts every week. It's a good way to keep on learning about the brain. Everyone should know more about the brain because it's crucial right now for the treatment of all children and adolescents. If you want to read more about the brain, here's my last book on the brain. I'm biased. It may be the best book you could get. So let's wrap up. We've come full circle, folks. Resiliency theory taught us a few things. 1, risk factors are the reason for poor life outcomes. But the resilient population taught us this. There are people with risk that can overcome, but those people needed what? Enough protective factors to see them through. And I gave you 3 steps to stabilize the most at-risk populations and get them going on the route to resiliency. 1, ritualize major anchor points, the anchor points of your day. 2, promote social comfort by teaching skills to improve our ability to get along with people who are different than us. And 3, build competencies, and to build competencies, promote focus. And if you can do all of these things, you can shift the subconscious brain from believing that you'll fail to believing you'll succeed. 3 steps for making everyone more resilient, and I pray they helped you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening in and joining us today. We are going to turn it over to the question and answer portion of our webinar today. That was a great presentation and lots of awesome information. We have several questions and some that are very relevant to COVID right now. And Dr. Sanchez, the first one is related to rituals. And can you discuss how maybe the lack of rituals during COVID has impacted everyone, and maybe discuss some ideas for rituals programs could implement during COVID, virtually? And you're still muted.
Better? Okay. The number one thing that we know is that more people are stressed, and stress impacts the body, mind, and spirit even. So we've been recommending that people maintain their rituals, that they engage in activities that make them feel better because that changes your chemistry. And even though you're socially distant, you can still make social connections. We find that the brain responds even when you're talking to someone through a chat like this or on the phone. The least effective response for communicating is text because the brain doesn't pick up empathy over text, but any kind of connection. So do things that make you feel better, still socially connect, and maintain your rituals.
Great. And that kind of relates to the next set of questions is thinking about using technology. How can we use technology to help us focus? Can focus exercises be successful, over technology, or are there particular exercises that you might recommend? Okay. The only reason the focus exercises in this presentation were through technology is because it was a tech presentation. You do not have to do technology to improve your focus. There are physical activities that improve your focus. We found yoga is a physical activity that improves focus. You can actually sit down and do concentration games or activities or looking at something in detail and trying to remember everything you saw and write it down. There has been a lot of studies on tech and focus, and we found that there are some tech kinds of activities that improve your focus. So it's not either or, but if you can research focus pretty easily now,
and you can find probably a list of 20 different kinds of things you can do to improve focus that have been well researched and proven. Technology doesn't mean you have to do technology, but it also doesn't mean that technology will fail.
Can you go back and cover a little bit, kind of remind folks why some people have lower dopamine than others? That's one question.
It's not just dopamine, it's dopamine where dopamine is. I mean, the nucleus accumbens is so crucial because it's in charge of things like sleeping, eating, emotional disorders, actually. A lot of the kids who have issues, a lot of people who are at risk of depression, a lot of issues with emotional disorders seem to have a lack of dopamine response in the nucleus accumbens. And that puts people at risk because they don't get some of the natural reinforcements. So it's reward deficit syndrome is what they used to call it. And it's, for many people, it was genetic initially. But the other thing we do find out is that you can improve the dopamine response by what you do. It's not just medication anymore. And one of the things that we found out improves dopamine response is rituals. And the more consistent they are, the more healthy ways you can get them. We do find out that people who are not naturally, don't have a naturally good dopamine system, for them to get the response with rituals, oftentimes it takes them longer. And that's the part that seems that where they struggle. It doesn't seem to come as quickly.
Thank you. The next question is about research on the amygdala size and the impact of trauma. Is there any research about the relationship between the size of the amygdala and maybe trauma or repeated trauma?
Oh God, that was the number one piece of research in relation to trauma initially. It's gotten a little bit more sophisticated, but trauma impacts the amygdala, function, response. Let me give you an example. Many adolescent males who were traumatized during adolescence, what we found was the swelling of the amygdala. What that basically signified was when the amygdala was overridden or became overly emotional, the serotonin around the amygdala could not dispense calming enough chemicals to bring the amygdala down. So the amygdala actually agitates quickly and doesn't go back down. A matter of fact, we have found genetic mutation occurring. For example, many individuals who are at risk, who have been traumatized, have the mutation to the tags around these that dispense serotonin to amygdala. But now we're finding that they are actually passing it on to their children, and their children are born with an amygdala that's incapable of calming down quickly. So yes, the amygdala is definitely changed in structure and in response. The other thing that's interesting is that your prefrontal cortex improvement will actually improve amygdala function, because it's your prefrontal cortex that controls your amygdala. So instead of just always thinking about medications that do well to calm the amygdala, one of the things we found out is the more time we can spend between incidents of overstress, the more the amygdala can become normalized. But if you strengthen your prefrontal cortex, it seems to exercise more control over the amygdala. So making your cortex stronger will actually help a lot.
Can you provide a couple examples of how you would strengthen your prefrontal cortex?
Your prefrontal cortex is in charge of learning. We found you improve your memory, it improves your prefrontal cortex. If you are learning more things, it improves your prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex is definitely engaged in all those kind of activities. So we've seen people just improve their memory, prefrontal cortex increases. People who pick up a new language, prefrontal cortex increases. So things like that seem to really help.
Great. One person asked, does being left or right brain make any difference in behavior?
Left and right brain is overstated because it's not as rigid as you think. Let me give you an example. We used to think that everybody who was left-handed had their language centers in the right side of their brain, and everyone who was right-handed had it in the left side of their brain. We found out that's not true. Most left-handed people still have it on the left side, but some people do have it inverse regardless of their hands. Left and right brain doesn't impact primitive brain as much. It seems to impact more kind of things of what you're drawn to, like creativity or math or things like that, maybe more. But as far as your primitive brain that controls emotion and initial memory response and automated responses, no.
Got it.
Temperament does though.
Okay. I think the next question, and I think folks are maybe thinking more about thinking about those rituals. So there's a couple of questions related to this, but one person was asking, would a healthy two-parent family help children with resiliency? And kind of related to that, one person was asking about, you know, how the parents influence, you know, rituals and, you know, if there's conflict, potentially negative impacting rituals.
The resiliency research found that two-parent families seem to have a less occurrence of risk. Single parent, as long as there was a non-conflicted relationship with at least one parent, was still better than nothing. But the overall thing still had to do with the health of the parents, where they could provide. But healthy parents and two-parent households seem to be able to cope with stressors better, where you can pass the kid on. That seemed to be a big deal, especially for low-income or at-risk families. Parenting had to do with a few factors, like how structured and safe the house are, whether they were aware of the child's behavior, if they disciplined with discussion. If the household provided those kinds of things, it seemed to be a huge difference. So it's, yes, two parents is better than not having parents. One parent, if it's not conflicted, is still pretty good, but the consistency of the parenting is the most important thing.
Got it. We have a couple of questions related to being able to connect. You talked about smiling. And so as we're all likely wearing masks while we're out, it's hard to see someone smiling while we're wearing facial mask. And then also one person mentioned, you know, those that may have sensory processing disorder, you know, just
Right.
generally may have some challenges processing facial expressions. What do you have any suggestions or thoughts about connecting during COVID or just general challenges?
Let's leave COVID out for 1 second. Let's go to the people who don't process sensory nonverbal cues well. One of the things we found out is that for many kids who have these kind of issues, helping them identify what nonverbal cues are, explaining to them what it means, but also having them mimic the appropriate response seems to change brain chemistry and help them learn the impact. That is crucial. In the cases of not being able to see a part of your face, empathy is not just face response. Empathy actually looks at other parts of your face besides your mouth, your eyes, your nose. But empathy also processes tone of voice, body postures, gestures. So our brains in milliseconds are reading all these cueings that seem to help anyway. But the other part of connection is the ability to be able to communicate with someone and find commonality. That seems to be the number one indicator of people who do really well with strangers. Can you get the commonalities? Can you disarm? And can you get the commonalities? Those are two skills that we teach people, and they seem to do really well with them.
Got it. Maybe we'll try to squeeze in one or two more questions. One person just really quickly was asking about mindfulness and math effectiveness and as a focus exercise. Could you comment on that?
Very good question. Yes, mindfulness and mindfulness exercises are focus exercises, many of them. So mindfulness as an activity teaches it very well. And if you can take children and adolescents through mindfulness, especially some of the activity things, we found it works just as well.
Great. And do you see any obvious differences in brain development in response to technology, particularly between teen males and females, and that may be more relevant as we're interacting online a lot more?
Yeah, there are some differences by gender. We found that girls who were more online tend to have more mood disorders, more withdrawal, more issues with depression. Everyone is being impacted by being overly involved with technology with the issues of focus. There is really, the research on gaming is sketchy, but there is one thing that is true. It does seem to dampen empathy response if your gaming tends to be more volatile in nature. The question is, does the dampening of the empathy response remain, or is it just temporary? And that's in debate right now. So we know that there are impacts, and there seems to be some slight impacts that are slightly different in boys and girls.
Got it. And is there a limit to how much dopamine we can process? And then related to that, does serotonin play into emotional and mental health?
All those calibrations are made by everyone's brains naturally. And so it's not like, here's the amount. There is a range that's considered normative, and that range is pretty big because people's brains are all slightly different. So it's not like this specific amount. Can you get dopamine? Probably not. Some people think that some people get addicted with certain things because they get dopamine from it, but most of those things tend to be fairly healthy. If they're not healthy, then it's an issue. But if they're healthy things you're engaging in to get dopamine, there's not really much issue of an over dopamine dose.
In particularly for youth with attention deficit disorder, are there specific focus exercises that you might recommend for those youth?
Yeah, they found out for kids who have more attention issues, all your focus exercises should start out with what is called active focus activities, where they can actually do something physical, or they're actually touching something rather than something that's more cognitive in nature. So we found out those kind of focus activities are highly recommended, while the more passive ones are not. They have to start with those kinds of engagement. It seems to work better.
Great. And I think this will be our last question. I know we're running over a little bit, but are the 3 steps you outlined more successful based on temperament?
Yeah,
I think that's the summary that you made.
Yeah, I mean, if you have an easy temperament, things are going to be easier to adopt, and that's just the way it is. If you have average temperament, it's a little bit easier. If you're shy and anxious or difficult temperament, it is going to be harder. But that's the nature of the game. If you were to go back and look at the temperament and diagnosis, you'll find more individuals who have diagnostic issues who are born with difficult or shy and anxious temperaments. So that's one of the things we're trying to address by saying some individuals need these kinds of things to be more prescriptive in their lives, while other people can gain them somewhat more naturally.
Great. And everyone is really interested in getting your social media handles. I know you mentioned them during the presentation. I was just going to ask quickly if you're okay with us sharing that.
Sure.
With everyone. Okay.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sanchez. If you want to have any closing remarks, and then we can
really briefly. One of the things I always want to make sure people understand about resiliency is this: resiliency doesn't mean you're expunged of the bad things that happen in your life. People who are resilient carry their scars with them, but the thing I want everyone to understand is you cope with the things that happen and you still have success. So I like to look at it like this: the story of resiliency is never written until the end. So no matter how bad things are, If people can become more resilient, they oftentimes can take the worst things in their life, turn it around, and make it a very positive thing for many other people who have similar experiences. And I know a lot of the people who are working with children and adolescents today, they're there because they're resilient individuals, and we thank you.